Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Hi, Professor Anderson. Wondering if you had a couple of minutes?
Of course, Paula.
Thanks. You sent me a letter recently about doing, an honors project? Inviting me to come in and talk about...
Right. Well, as your academic advisor, it's my job to look out for your academic interests. And based on your grades and some very positive feedback I've heard from your professors, I wanted to formally invite you to consider doing an honors project.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Actually, I kind of wanted to ask you, quite frankly, how much work it would probably be? I mean, I'm going to be spending a lot of time applying to law schools next semester, and...
Well, let me tell you how it works, and then you can decide from there.
Okay.
Basically, the honors project is an opportunity to do some in-depth work on a topic you're interested in before graduating college. You register for the class, but it doesn't work the same way a regular class does. You find a professor who you want to work with. You ask the professor, a sort of mentor, who's knowledgeable on the topic you're interested in, the topic you're going to write your honors thesis on.
Writing a thesis? That's part of the project? How many pages are we talking?
Usually about 50, but it's a valuable experience, writing a thesis paper.
So, basically, after I register for the class, I need to ask a professor who'll sort of help me.
Actually, you need to do that. A professor needs to agree to oversee your honors project before you register.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I know it sounds kind of daunting, but that's what the professor's there for, to help guide you through the different steps of the process. And most students are very pleased with the experience. They're able to demonstrate advanced research skills, which is important, especially in your case. Writing an honors thesis would be a big plus.
You think so?
Absolutely, especially considering your plans since you're applying to law schools. It shows initiative that you've done well as an undergraduate to be allowed to do the honors project, that you're able to work independently, and of course, you would graduate with honors.
Yeah, it does sound good. It's just, I've never written something like that before, so...
Well, you choose something you're interested in. Maybe you can even expand a shorter research paper from another class, or...
So, maybe... I took this course from Professor Connolly, his course on comparative governments last semester, and did pretty well. I wrote a paper, actually, on political parties in Venezuela, and he seemed to like my research. Anyway, I got an A in the course.
Good. So it sounds like you do have a general idea for a topic, and you might know what professor you want to work with. And look, it's still a couple of weeks before registration. Maybe you should talk to Professor Connolly and then get back to me.
Yeah, I will. Thanks. I'll come by again sometime next week.
That's fine. Good luck.
What does Professor Anderson imply when he says this?
They're able to demonstrate advanced research skills, which is important, especially in your case. Writing an honors thesis would be a big plus.
What does the woman imply when she says this?
Yeah, it does sound good. It's just, I've never written something like that before, so...
Listen to part of a lecture in a journalism class. The professor has been discussing newspapers.
About 40 years ago, half of all Americans felt they'd be lost without a daily newspaper. But today, only 1 in 10 Americans say they'd be lost without a paper. In fact, today, half of all Americans say they don't need a newspaper at all. And so people in the newspaper industry are trying to figure out how they can get more people reading the newspaper more often. They're trying to crack journalism's riddle for the ages. What makes people read newspapers? Okay, well, let me ask you. As a journalism student, what do you think is the answer to this question? Elizabeth?
I would probably try to improve the content of the newspaper.
Better content? You mean like well-written editorials and articles?
Well, I mean, provide more interesting content. Like, I would first try to find out what readers really want to read, and then put that into the paper.
Yes, in fact, not too long ago, there was an extensive study conducted to investigate what draws people to newspapers. They found out that there's a clear, strong link between satisfaction with content and overall readership. Those newspapers that contained what the readers wanted most brought in the most readers. No big surprise there, right? So, what kind of content brings in readers? The study found that people-centered local news ranks at the top of the list. Stories about ordinary people. For example, you could write about the experiences of those who were involved in a news story and their friends and relatives. The vantage points would be those of ordinary people, not of police or other officials, okay? Now, the study also showed that people want more stories about movies, TV, and weather, and fewer stories and photos about natural disasters and accidents. So, to get reader satisfaction, you need to select the right topics, and within those topics, the right news events or stories to cover. Yes, James.
It seems to me that a lot of what you just mentioned doesn't line up with the principles of good journalism. Catering to readers' tastes may improve overall readership, but what about the social responsibilities that newspapers have? I mean, there are some topics that newspapers need to write about in order to serve the public interest. Those topics may not always be fun and interesting for the average reader, but it's still the newspaper's responsibility to make that information available to the public.
That's a good point. You need a good mix of content. You can't just rush towards an attractive topic and forget about the reporting role of newspapers. There's a danger of going soft. Newspapers do have to perform their obligations to citizens. So, what newspapers sometimes do is to combine serious journalism with a reader-friendly presentation. Let me give you an example. When the Justice Department opened an investigation on the local police, some pretty serious stuff that could be boring to some readers. Well, one local newspaper ran a lead story on their front page, but they also simplified the format by including small breakout boxes that presented, in a nutshell, the highlights of the story. That way, they could report the serious stories they needed to report and still hold their readers' attention. Okay? Going back to the research on readership growth we were talking about, the most vital step of all, the study shows, may be making the paper easier to use. How can we make the paper easier to use? Well, it means stories need to include information, such as phone numbers, times, dates, addresses, websites, and the like, so that readers can go and do things based on what they've read.
Professor Ellington, when you said we need to make the paper easier to use, I thought you were going to say something about use of graphics, colors, and stuff like that.
Well, I guess those things do help in a way, but it turned out that those contemporary touches, such as more attractive designs, extensive use of color, and informational graphics, matter much less than you'd expect. Surprising, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. How about service? Does the study say anything about improving service? I don't think people are going to subscribe if the paper doesn't arrive or shows up late.
Or shows up wet, which, by the way, happened to me this morning. Oh, absolutely. Service affects readership. In fact, improving your service is much more likely to increase your readership than making changes in your editorial content. Not only on-time delivery in good condition, but also things like efficient billing, affordability, yes?
They could also, increase the number of sites where they sell single copies.
Certainly, that's one way to improve service.
What does the student imply when he says this?
It seems to me that a lot of what you just mentioned doesn't line up with the principles of good journalism. Catering to readers' tastes may improve overall readership, but what about the social responsibilities that newspapers have?
Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
I don't think people are going to subscribe if the paper doesn't arrive or shows up late.
Or shows up wet, which, by the way, happened to me this morning. Oh, absolutely. Service affects readership.
What does the professor imply when he says this?
Or shows up wet, which, by the way, happened to me this morning. Oh, absolutely.
Listen to part of a lecture in a geology class.
Beginning in the late 1960s, geologists began to uncover some evidence of a rather surprising kind when they looked at various places around the world. And what they found out when they examined rocks from about 750 million years ago to about 580 million years ago, they found that it seemed that glaciers covered the entire surface of the Earth, from pole to pole, including the tropics. How did they come to this astonishing conclusion? What was the evidence for this? Especially when glaciers today are found only at the poles or in the mountain? Well, basically, when glaciers grow and move, they leave behind a distinctive deposit consisting of primarily, at least on the top level, of ground up little bits of rock. They almost look like rocks that have been deposited by streams, if you've ever seen those. And that's caused because, although the glacier is ice, it is actually flowing very slowly. And as it moves, it grinds the top layer of rock. It breaks off pieces and carries them away. So when you have glaciation, you have a distinctive pattern of these pieces of rock, which are called erratics. Erratics are rocks. They're the stones that are often carried long distances by glaciers. So in the 1960s and onward up through the 1990s, we keep finding evidence for glaciation no matter what the latitude, even in tropical latitudes. Now today there are glaciers in the tropics, but only at very high elevations. But 750 million years ago, apparently there were glaciers even at sea level in the tropics. How could this have happened? Well, first, the growth of glaciers benefits, if you will, from a kind of a positive feedback loop called the ice albedo effect. With the ice albedo effect, glaciers, because they're white, reflect light and heat much more than does liquid water or soil and rock, which are dark and absorb heat. So the more glaciers there are, the more heat is reflected. So the climate gets cooler and glaciers grow even more. However, normally on a global scale, there is a major process that functions to curb the growth of glaciers, and that process involves carbon dioxide. Now, we're all familiar with the notion that carbon dioxide is what we call a greenhouse gas. The more carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere, the more heat the atmosphere retains. That's what a greenhouse gas does. So the greenhouse gas effect is kind of the opposite of the albedo effect. Now, as it happens, when silicate rocks, which is a very common class of rock, when they're exposed to the air and to normal weathering, they erode. Carbon dioxide is attracted to these eroding rocks and binds to them, forming calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate is eventually washed into the ocean, where it settles to the bottom. This process, this forming of calcium carbonate, has the effect of sucking the carbon dioxide out of the air and storing it at the bottom of the ocean. Now, follow me here. The process that's sucking carbon dioxide out of the air, keeping the greenhouse gas levels low, cannot happen if the rock is covered with ice. So, while glaciers reflect light and heat, cooling the Earth, they at the same time cover rocks, so there's less calcium carbonate formed, which leaves more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Higher levels of carbon dioxide keep the atmosphere warm, which slows the growth of glaciers. So it's a balance. and the glacier growth remains pretty much under control. Now, what happened 750 million years ago to upset that balance? It seems a relatively simple explanation, actually. 750 million years ago, all the major continents are rocky, bare, and pretty much lined up along the equator. They hadn't yet moved to where they are today. So what happened was perhaps a slight cooling of, the very slight and temporary cooling of the sun, which still happens from time to time, and the Earth starts to cool. The ice starts to spread on the oceans, starting at the poles. Now, by the time the ice reaches about 2/3 of the way to the equator, it's too late. See, because the continents are the last things to be covered by the glaciers, they continue weathering. The rocks keep eroding and the carbon dioxide levels keep falling. So the ice albedo effect from the glaciers is increasing in strength, while the atmosphere continues to lose its ability to retain heat, making glacier growth unstoppable. Now you have what's called a runaway freeze. And for perhaps as long as 50 million years, possibly with some interludes, the Earth was frozen from pole to pole, like a giant snowball.
Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
Well, basically, when glaciers grow and move, they leave behind a distinctive deposit consisting of primarily, at least on the top level, of ground up little bits of rock. They almost look like rocks that have been deposited by streams, if you've ever seen those.
Why does the professor say this?
They almost look like rocks that have been deposited by streams, if you've ever seen those.